Hello and welcome to my latest revision video for OCR Religious Studies. This time the focus is on religious experience. As you can imagine, the topic is not without controversy. Many people have claimed to have a religious experience, but are often treated with derision. However, religious experience is not something new, and it's certainly not restricted to the major religions such as Christianity or Islam. In this video, I'm going to look at those theories that relate to religious experience and also some of the criticism of those theories. So perhaps the most famous book with regard to religious experience is The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. William James was a philosopher, the brother of Henry James, the novelist. In 1901 and 1902, he gave a series of lectures in Edinburgh, the Gifford Lectures, which were subsequently published as The Varieties of Religious Experience. What James attempts to do is to describe what common traits may exist between those people who claim to have experienced the religious. He said that there are four major traits that could be identified, which, were they within the description of someone's religious experience, were likely to suggest that they had indeed had a religious experience. And he uses historical examples, such as St. Teresa of Avila, to demonstrate what he means. The first of these traits is ineffability. In short, this is the fact that words cannot adequately express the religious experience. This doesn't seem unusual. If someone were to claim to have experienced something religious, then it's very likely that they are not going to be able to describe it, in the same way as they were able to describe an everyday event. The second quality, or second trait, rather, is noetic quality. This is the fact that the religious experience gives knowledge which is unlike the knowledge that you can obtain through any other human experience. And again, this is probably not a surprise. People who have religious experiences often talk about being given an insight into the divine, which we couldn't ordinarily obtain through our day-to-day lives, or indeed through religious acts such as prayer. The third trait is transience. This is the fact that the experience is short-lived, often less than 30 minutes. Lastly, passivity. The person receiving the religious experience knows that they're in the grip of a superior power who's taking an active role, and that they are simply the passive individual who is experiencing the divine. In the 20th and 21st century, theologians such as Richard Swinburne have attempted to develop ideas with regard to religious experience. In the case of Swinburne, he puts forward an argument for religious experience based on personal testimony. Swinburne talks of two principles within personal testimony. The first of those is the principle of credulity. If someone says that they have experienced something, they probably have. And secondly, the principle of testimony. We should believe what others say. This might seem a fairly simple concept, but you can imagine that someone who claims to have had a religious experience is often treated, as Richard Swinburne would feel, somewhat unfairly. For example, if I said that I'd seen a helicopter flying outside my window this afternoon, then it's unlikely that someone would probably question me over that matter. They would probably agree with what I had to say. Secondly, they wouldn't ask for any proof. However, were I to have claimed to have seen angels flying outside my window, they probably would be unlikely to believe me. And secondly, they might suggest that I'm lying. However, there is a problem with this. People can often hold sincere beliefs, and when questioned about them, will stick to their story. For example, I could have a sincere belief that Arsenal are the best football team in the world. Sincerity of belief doesn't actually mean that it's true. It's not to say that I'm lying. It could be that I do genuinely and sincerely hold the belief that Arsenal are the best football team in the world. However, when compared to other football teams, we might suggest that that isn't the case. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the different types of religious experience. The first of these is the corporate religious experience. In short, these are religious experiences which are shared by a number of people within a setting. An example of this is the Toronto Blessing. You can look up the Toronto Blessing online yourself. There are videos of it, for example, on YouTube. Basically, it's a church in Canada in which large numbers of people claim to have had religious experiences, and these seem to have affected those people in various ways. For example, speaking in tongues, rolling around on the floor, spontaneous laughter, etc. One argument against corporate religious experiences are that they are some kind of mass hysteria, perhaps by people who are susceptible to this kind of behaviour. The next religious experience to talk about is personal religious experience. Many people have claimed to have experienced personal religious, or as Rudolf Otto describes, mystical experiences. Rudolf Otto explored these in detail, and he described them using various different types of trait, as William James did. He described the numinous. The numinous in this regard is an experience of God which transcends everyday experience. Secondly, he uses the term wholly other to describe those experiences. These are experiences which, as you might appreciate, are out of the ordinary. Lastly, he uses a Latin term, which I'm not going to try and say here, which is to describe the mysterious and seductive nature of these experiences. So what might this look like? Well, an example of this is St. Teresa of Avila. This is an example of the type of religious experience that Otto is alluding to. Her description of religious experience appears to be almost sexual in nature. She's pierced by a golden lance. However, she was fairly conscious that she could be accused, being a nun, of being sexually frustrated. Her argument is that if that were the case, then she would have been left with feelings of disgust. So this is a kind of joy and ecstasy that she experienced through a divine experience, rather than through any kind of psychological traits which we might want to suggest would be the case. Okay, the next type of experience is conversion experience. I'm not going to say very much about this, but in simple terms, a conversion experience is where a person changes their life from one state to another. One of the most famous examples is St. Paul's conversion to Christianity, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with that. Okay, so how do we understand religious experience? Basically, we can understand it in three different ways. First of all, as a union with a greater power. Secondly, as a psychological effect. And thirdly, as a physiological effect. So there seems to be three ways in which we can understand religious experiences, but again, those are all subject to some criticism. For example, a union with a greater power seems to suggest that you have um, a union with something other than another human being. But this is, in many ways, quite vague. Secondly, as a psychological effect, we could claim that people are subject to, um, illusions, psychological conditions, etc. Thirdly, as a psychological effect, as a physiological effect, we may well claim that people's experiences can be affected by what they eat and what they drink. This leads on to the objections to the theories that I've discussed within this video. The first of which is that religious experience are mind dependent and so essentially private. Someone who has a religious experience is essentially claiming that they experienced it, and aside from those corporate experiences, which again you could argue are religious experiences of the individual within a corporate setting, are essentially private. You don't have access to other people's minds, so therefore can't experience the same thing. Secondly, sincerity doesn't mean validity. I can be very sincere about something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a valid argument. You have people who have very sincere political views, which most people might find abhorrent, such as Nazism. So sincerity doesn't mean to say that it's necessarily valid. David Hume suggested that humans are drawn to the unusual, and certainly given the amount of TV programs dedicated to kind of unusual things, Bigfoot, whatever it might be, we are apparently, naturally, perhaps not naturally, but psychologically interested in kind of the unusual within life. The ineffability, rather, of experience also means it can't be described objectively. It means that it's very difficult to describe religious experience in kind of objective terms. The next objection is that our minds are often impacted by our diets, and by this I mean that many people who claim to have a religious experience may well have been affected by food, the lack of food, alcohol, drugs, etc. St. Teresa of Avila, for example, may have had a diet or may have had, something within her diet which made her, feel the way that she did. The next objection, quite simply, people are mistaken. We make mistakes all the time, and we can make mistakes about religious experience. Some, theologians would claim that the extent of these mistakes make it implausible that so many people, given the number of testimony over thousands of years, have been mistaken, that there is some truth in religious experience, but undoubtedly there are likely to be some religious experiences where people are mistaken about what they have seen, felt, etc. We also need to remember that an experience need not be religious. One can be profoundly moved by a number of experiences. You can think of someone who perhaps has grown up, they're in their 30s or 40s, and they have never seen the ocean. Now, if you took them to see the ocean for the first time, it's likely that they are going to be sort of profoundly moved by that experience. We wouldn't claim that that was a religious experience, and yet, something that many people may perhaps take for granted, seeing the sea or the ocean, would have a profound effect on someone else. Lastly, it's the case that religious experience seems to be a matter of interpretation. Many people would claim to have had religious experience, whereas others would claim that the experience that they had wasn't religious at all. So there certainly seems to be some debate as to whether or not we can interpret religious experiences in the same way, and whether or not people do have religious experiences.